A lot of people love to believe that the church is the bride of Christ, and one of the reasons why they believe that the church is the bride of Christ is because the Church of Philadelphia is described as a woman who will receive a crown and glory at the end of the age. She'll be the one that will be saved by Jesus. But in my telling of how I read it, I feel like it's talking about a woman, one person, because only one person can receive a crown, because only one person can have a head to have a crown. Thousands of people aren't just going to be given crowns by Jesus, especially since they haven't actually done anything to deserve that crown. There's also another prophecy about the temple being defiled. A sort of consummation is described in one of the Bible books. A consummation is like sex, so it sounds like it's talking about sex between two people. And when someone gets married, sex and consummation is part of that marriage deal. The Bible speaks badly of Babylon the Great because she's a prostitute. It speaks badly of Jezebel because she's like a seductress. And there's many other prostitutes that are also spoken about in a sort of disgusting light just because they're a prostitute. But yet there's one story which is a very famous story, which is the story of Jericho. And in this story, the men of God, brackets God, want to destroy the city. But God says for them to destroy the city, they must first walk round the temple 7 times, and on the 7th time it will fall. But out of all the people in the city, there was one person that God chose to save. This person was a woman named Rahab, who was a prostitute. And God says that because of the good work that this woman has done, because this woman hid some spies in her flat, so she looked after some people of the Israelites, God. And because she did this, God said that her and her whole family will be saved. So when the army marched around the city 7 times, Rahab and her whole family were saved. Okay, you can have 2 tellings of this story. You can have one telling which says that God is an evil, vile murderer that wants to kill everyone and does kill everyone. Or you can say that actually the city represents the old age and the beliefs that they had and how things were in the past. And Rahab represents Eve, Babylon the Great, the prostitute woman, the woman who gives out lots of love, and yet everyone insults her for being a prostitute. But God says because of the work that she did, her and her people will be saved. And so if you see it in that light, then it becomes better because her people, well, she's Eve, so all her people are just all people on earth, and they'll all be saved. Everything else will fall. Things like Christianity and other religions, old ways, old beliefs, old views of what right and wrong is. If you see it on that light, it's a lot better. And people constantly go on about how Babylon the Great is a whore, she's a terrible person. But here we have a story where the whore is the one that's saved. So this is again a prophecy that when this woman Messiah comes, she will maybe be considered a whore or a prostitute. But at the end of the day, she and her people are going to be the ones that are saved. The next story I want to talk about is Herodes and her daughter. This is the story of how John the Baptist got his head chopped off. How the story starts with this one is that the king really wants to kill John the Baptist, but because John the Baptist has a big following, there's a lot of people that support him and follow him, he doesn't want to lose the support of the people, so he chooses not to kill John the Baptist. Anyway, one day the king holds a big party and they called forth this little dancing girl to come up to the king and do a little dance. And everyone in the hall sort of looked at her and saw her as being really cute. The king was really impressed with her talent and her dancing skills. And as a reward for her dancing ability, the king said, I will grant you one wish and you can have anything you want. And this daughter said that she wants the head of John the Baptist. Because the king couldn't go back on his word, he then went off and killed John the Baptist and brought her this head. And she got her wish. I think you're an idiot if you believe that story. I'm not saying that the story didn't happen, but if you think that the only reason why John the Baptist was killed was because of this little girl and the story about how it was her wish for this to happen, that's insane. To me, it feels like one more story that just puts down women, even cute little dancing women, The Christian's telling of this story, gives this hidden message that you can't trust women, even if they're cute and sweet, They might have hidden agendas and really want heads of people and stuff, and it's nonsense. The king wanted him dead, and it's obvious that both him and maybe the mother as well, there must have been some motherly persuasion, otherwise this girl might have not said these things. But yeah, it sounds like the king and the mother of this child have got together. They got their innocent cute little daughter to do a little dance, impress the whole audience, and then at the end she was told to say, I want the head of John the Baptist as like a setup so the king can do what he wanted to do, which is to get rid of John the Baptist. And he could use this little girl as a sort of decoy and make it look like it was her wish and not his wish. It's very smart because, it's tricked the people into believing that John the Baptist must die. Why? Because this cute little girl wants it to happen. When in reality, it's obviously the king that wants it to happen. and perhaps the mother too. But John the Baptist is kind of like the second most important character in the Bible, I guess, because you've got Jesus, which is the main one, and then John the Baptist, which is kind of like his co-worker, I guess. And so to have this co-worker being killed because this innocent little girl wants his head or something, kind of like saying a hidden message of don't trust the innocent little girl. It makes women look sick. And the Bible also does place a lot of blame on the mother as well, Herodes. So it makes the girl look sick and it makes the mother look like she's scheming. And it's not just anyone's head, it's kind of like the head leader of Jesus' church. He's, in the Christian mind, is like the good guy, and so the good guy was killed by an innocent little girl. It makes women seem like they're untrustworthy because they're the ones that kind of condemned John the Baptist to death. Whereas in my telling of the story is that I believe that this story is actually prophesying something that's going to happen in the future. This innocent little girl is being used as a sort of Christ figure. She's going to be used by God the Mother and her partner. She's going to be used as a way of destroying Jesus, who is what I believe to be the Antichrist. I say this because people didn't want John the Baptist to die, just like they don't want Jesus to die right now. But when this little girl wanted it, suddenly they were okay with it, because in their mind, this girl had done enough to earn a wish, and that was her wish, so she deserved for it to come true. This girl has managed to change the mind of people so that people believed that John the Baptist shouldn't die to starting to believe, oh, actually, he should die because this is what this girl wants. That girl is kind of like what I believe this Christ figure is going to do. This Christ figure is going to want Jesus to be destroyed, and she'll use her charm and her talent to try and make that happen. Although, of course, in the realistic telling of the story, the girl would not want that guy dead, because that's ridiculous. No child really wants another person dead, especially if they can have any other wish. I think ice cream would be on the top of their list, not people's heads on a plate. But if the only reason why she wanted the guy dead in that story is because she's actually prophesying the future Messiah who's going to want Jesus dead, well, that can explain it. And why does a lot of the blame go on to the mother as well? Well, because this is pointing at God the Mother wants Jesus and his disciples of liars to die. John the Baptist was just going around preaching about God the Father, and well, if she's God the Mother, she doesn't like people that go around preaching about God the Father because they're preaching against her. She is the only God, I believe. So anyone that wants to put God the Father before God the Mother, that's exactly the same as putting Satan before God, in my mind. I believe Jesus isn't a real character, it's just a made-up Antichrist. I believe he's a test for all the evildoers. Jesus did say that a doctor comes to heal, but he's more of a teacher, so he comes to teach people a lesson. I believe he's a made-up character that's kind of destroying the world because it's encouraging division and it's encouraging people to just have blind faith in something that's just not true. And it's encouraging people to believe that all these stories are true stories that actually happened when really they're all not. Well, that's why I believe that story was written in the way that it was. Okay, next up I'm going to talk about the story of Naomi and Ruth. Naomi was a lady who married someone and then had 2 sons. But as her 2 children became adults, her husband died. Later on, the 2 sons died. But before they died, both of them had got married to someone. And so now Naomi was just left as a widow with 2 daughters-in-law. Because when someone married back then, the daughters would always marry into the father's side of the family. The daughters-in-law were part of Naomi's family, but Naomi wanted to go back home to her homeland because now that her sons and husband had died, she felt like there was no reason to stay where she was, so she wanted to go back. Both the daughters-in-law wanted to come back, but she told them that now that their husband is dead, they're probably better off staying behind because that's where their family is. One of them agreed and walked off. The other one, which is Ruth, said, no, I'm part of your family now. I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to stay loyal to you. I'm going to go wherever you go, and I'm going to help you throughout the rest of your life. So Ruth became really loyal to Naomi. When they go back to Naomi's land, Ruth works hard on the fields to pick up grain on the field to feed her mother-in-law. But one day, whilst picking up the corn off the field, she meets a man called Boaz. Boaz is a relative. Boaz takes pity on the 2 because they're now on their own and they're both widows, and he wants to help Ruth by marrying her. But there's another relative who's a closer relation to him, and so he must have first pick. I think that's absolutely revolting, how you must marry someone who's the closest relative. It really shows that this is a backward society. But anyway, they're going to have a bunch of deformed children and they'll probably all die and whatever. Naomi also wants to sell off some of her land, and as part of the agreement in Jewish customs, the nearest relative must have the offer of buying the land, and they must take up any widows and look after the widows at the same time, who would have taken the land and Ruth as part of the agreement. It's absolutely disgusting how women are treated like possessions, just something you can buy. But anyway, sick land, yeah. all these people would have suffered a hell of a lot back in that time, and this is partly the reason why. Laws back then are only favoured towards guys and people with dicks. So what do? You kill them and you bring them back to life as women, and then they suffer all the consequence of the stupid laws that they made. Ha. But as Jewish customs, if Ruth would have had any more children, which is likely she would have had more children because they probably would have slept together. By that I mean he probably would have raped her, because men back then were all like pigs. But there's one good thing about the story, which was that if Ruth would have had any children, by that I mean a son specifically, because only males could inherit land, her children would have had to inherit the land because she married into Naomi's family, so technically Ruth is part of Naomi's family, and because the land actually belonged to Naomi's husband. Although Naomi might have not been able to own the land because she was a woman, males can do, because they're all disgustingly sexist back then, but all males in the family can own the land. So if Ruth would have had another child, because Ruth is part of Naomi's family, if her child would have been a son, he would have been able to inherit the land, because the land was originally owned by his kind of grandfather-in-law. Anyway, because the first nearest relative already had children with another wife, he didn't want to buy this land because he didn't want to risk Ruth having a son, because then all the land and inheritance would go to that child and not his other children. And so because of that, he refused to marry Ruth, and then Ruth was free to marry Boaz. And this relationship that they had redeemed Naomi's family, and it saved the family because the inheritance stayed within the family. I've read the story carefully, and that's apparently how the story goes. It's a ridiculous story, I know. It's extremely sexist, and it frustrates me how only males can inherit, but it was a male-dominated world. It was a world that only accepted males as rulers, only accepted males as inheritors and stuff like this, and so you can't change the law which existed, and the law was that only males can inherit. But there is a subtle message behind this, because it's all about redeeming Naomi's family. It's all about keeping the inheritance within Naomi's family, and Naomi is a woman. So to me, Naomi represents God the Mother, and it shows how God the Mother worked around the law to try and keep the inheritance within her family. Even though Ruth isn't actually a blood relative of hers, she married into her family, and the whole story is about how she wanted the inheritance to stay in her family. If Ruth, however, hadn't been with Naomi, if she had have stayed behind and didn't stay loyal to Naomi, the closest nearest relative would have bought the land. Because there would have only been one widow who's obviously probably too old to have kids, he would have bought the land, looked after Naomi, but probably wouldn't have slept with her, and so there wouldn't have been any more children, and so all the land would have gone to the closest nearest relative and or his family. But Naomi wanted the land to stay within her family, and obviously wanted it to go to someone who would actually look after her in a nice way, not in a crappy way. And so because Ruth stayed loyal to Naomi, Naomi was able to redeem her land and keep it within her family, because Ruth would have married Boaz. So the land, yes, would be the males, of course, that's just how it was, but it would also be Ruth's. And because Ruth was very loyal to Naomi, Naomi would feel more like it's her land as well. And because Ruth was young, she was obviously going to go on to have children, and so the land would go to the new children that would be born from Ruth. And because Ruth and Naomi obviously have a very close connection, I guess Naomi would also have a close connection with Ruth's children, and so it would feel like the land stays in her family. Whereas if Ruth hadn't been there, the land would have just gone to this other man and his family. So in this story, it's Ruth that's the saviour. So in this story, Naomi represents God the Mother, and Ruth represents like a female Christ who works hard to look after God the Mother and redeems God the Mother and keeps the inheritance inside her family rather than having the inheritance go to another family. I absolutely hate this story because it's so degrading towards women, because it says how only men can inherit and they have to go through all this trouble to keep the land in the family. I mean, technically, what should have happened is Naomi inherits the land, Naomi gets to keep the land. End of. If Naomi dies, then Ruth gets to keep the land. That's how it kind of should be, but no, that's not how it was, because people back then were disgustingly sexist, and women can only inherit things through marriage, providing there's a living male relative. It's an awful story, but at the same time, that again is another story that is about what the Bible is about, because the Bible is about a marriage. It's about a marriage covenant between a male and a female. And so if this story is prophesying what God's covenant is, God is God the Mother, but everyone wants God the Father, because they only worship males, but one day they're going to realize that this male entity doesn't exist, and so God the Mother is going to need this female Christ to help her. Naomi would go out every day to collect the wheat, just like this female Christ would go out to collect the information, to give the information out. But the only way they can accept this female Christ is if there's also a male in the family, and so this woman has to marry someone, so that way the world will have a father. I believe that the female is more powerful than the male, and this story hints it too, because it's the female Naomi who has the land, who owns the land. Although she technically can't own the land because only males can. Hence why she has to give it to someone else, but she's found a way of keeping it in her family, by getting her nearest relative to marry someone. Naomi is redeemed through this marriage covenant between her daughter-in-law and this other man, and likewise on earth, God the Mother is going to be redeemed through this female Christ figure and her partner who she's going to marry. I hate this story because of its sexism, but I do like this story. Why? Because it brings up these issues and it shows, just how horrible it would be to know that this is your land, but you can't own it because you don't have a dick, It's an awful story, but it's what happened. Not that it's actually a true story, but it's what happened to many, many families. And even to this day, this still happens. Some countries around the world do have the laws that say that only men can inherit land. Sick. The next story I'm going to talk about is the story of Sapphira. I believe this is such an important story because Passover is supposed to be one of the celebrated holy days of Christ and of the Christian religion and of the Jewish religion. But my telling of the story makes so much more sense than their telling. Their telling is that 40 days after Jesus was sacrificed, he went up to be with the Father. But he said, in 10 days' time, the Spirit is going to come upon you and you're all going to be blessed. 10 days later, at Pentecost, they were all in a room and apparently they all started speaking tongues and speaking each other's language, even though they didn't speak each other's language. According to what happened, some people were witnesses of this and they were so impressed by what they saw and heard that they chose to sell off some of their land and give these prophets all their money that they got for the land. That's the Christian's version of it. But my telling of it is that these preachers were actually conning people. The people that they were conning wouldn't have spoken more than one language, so they wouldn't have known if these prophets that were talking to each other, if they were speaking each other's languages or if they were just talking gobbledygooch, they wouldn't have been able to tell the difference between what gobbledygooch is and what a real language is. Because these people were simpletons, they were peasants, they didn't know any other language other than their own language, so you could have just been going, and people would have believed that I was speaking some real language, and I wasn't. And the fact that straight after this miracle happened, these people agreed to give them all their money and sell off some of their land and give them all the money for it, that's a clear sign that this was just a setup, a con. If you don't believe me, well, look at what happened to Sapphira. This is a classic story of some terrible preachers that are willing to lie, rob, steal, and even go to the extremes of murder just to get what they want. To me, the story of Sapphira is so much evidence that that is the case, that is the truth about the story. The story goes that the husband of Sapphira sold some of the land and they got some money for it, but they decided to hold some of it back and just give I don't know how much, but a certain amount of it, but just hold a bit back. And when the prophets found out that they held some money back, the husband was suddenly struck down by God. And then the next day, the wife goes to find out what happened to the husband, and she too was struck dead by God. And it's just what the hell? God didn't strike these people down. It's obvious that the prophets strike these people down. The prophets found out that they sold the land for so much, and they actually held back some of the money. But because the prophets didn't want just some of the money, they wanted all the money. They were greedy, horrible prophets. They were prophets that were only using the name of God just so that they can make money for themselves, just so they can pretend that they're the true people of Christ. They're the true prophets of Christ. The only thing they're thinking about is, what do I have to do to get these people to give up their land so that we can get the money from it? That's the only thing that was on their mind. And they didn't just want just some of the money, they wanted all of the money. These prophets were very greedy, selfish, horrible people. They thought, okay, well, what we do is we kill these people, we take all the money, then we go to the other people who we're trying to con money out of, and we tell them that God struck them down because they held back some of the money. That way, all these other people that have promised or have said that they would sell off some of their land and give off all the money, these people, they won't want to hold back some of the money because they'll be too scared that they too might be struck dead by God. You hear about these things in Africa all the time. People con people into believing that they're possessed with demons, or con people into believing that they have special powers and that they can do miracles. But for them to get the miracles happen, you have to give them some money. And then sometimes these people do get mysteriously struck down by God or mysteriously disappear, and you have no idea what's happened to them. But it's obvious that these people have been killed, murdered by human beings, because God doesn't just strike people down. I suppose you could have like a stroke or a heart attack or something like that, but this does not sound like something like that, because the chances of a couple having a heart attack within 2 days of each other is extremely unlikely. And for a couple to have a heart attack within 2 days of each other, and for there to be this sort of money deal going awry where they promised to give some money and they decided to hold back money that they only promised to give because they believed that some people were speaking in tongues, speaking languages that they've never heard or never understood before because they don't speak any other language but one. This whole thing is a classic case of these people are being scammed out of their money, and Jesus' disciples who are doing this scam, who are part of this scam, they don't like how these people have held back some of their money. If I told you that I went down to some old church and there was a bunch of guys talking in tongues and they were all speaking different languages, but they could all hear and understand each other. And they've also just said that if I sell off my land and give them all the money that I have for the house that I've just bought a few years ago, if I sell off my house and give it to them, they're going to bless me. If I told you that, you'd think that I've gone crazy, that these people are conning me. So why wouldn't you think that this is what they did back then? It's far more likely that they were conning people. And then for two people to end up dead over this deal that they got. You'd be stupid if you didn't think that the preachers were ones that killed these people over this money that they tried to hold back, as a way of threatening other people into also not holding back the money. I think you're so silly if you've heard this story and you don't see that side of the story. I have spoken to my granny about this story, and she's 100% convinced that it was God who struck down these people because these people lied, and because they lied, they were sinners and they deserved to die. And I can't believe my granny said that. I like her, she's a nice person, but no one deserves to die because they promised to give £50,000 to charity, but then later on decide to only give £40,000 to charity. If you're giving a huge amount of money to charity, it doesn't matter how much you promise to give, because at the end of the day, it's your money. If you want to give 50,000 and then later change your mind and only want to give £10, £10 is better than nothing, okay? Yes, you might have broken a promise, but killing someone, murder, is far worse than lying to someone about how much money you're going to donate to charity. It's different, however, if you've actually gone around getting money off people and promising to give their money to charity. And if you've held back some of that money, that makes sense. But this money was their money, and they had every right to change their mind. Yes, okay, they might have lied about it, but then there's two sides of every story. This is what my granny said, that they deserved to die because they told these people that they were going to give them all the money, but they actually gave only some of it, and hence they lied and they deserved to be punished. But there is two sides in every story, and from my side of the story, what I see is that maybe these people were scared of the prophets. Maybe these people felt like the only reason why they were giving their money to these people is because these people were threatening them, and they didn't want to cause an argument, so they said that this was all the money just to get rid of them. But when they realized that they had spies and that the prophets knew how much they actually did get for the land, that was when the problem turned into a disaster. Because what happened next is they died, okay? These were people that were going to give a lot of money to charity, and they died for trying to help. Land in London costs about £200,000. Imagine if you sold your £200,000 plot of land and gave 90% of that to charity, and then you died for doing that because God wanted you to give all of that money and not just 90% of it. Don't you think that would be unfair? And I don't care what my granny says about, oh, but they lied about giving 100% and they only gave less than 100%. It's like, what the fuck? They were giving money to charity. But in my mind, they were giving that money because they were scared, not because they were trying to help them. And their fear of these people made them easy targets in the prophet's mind. And that was what caused them to be killed. And the fact that they were killed, they were very entitled to be scared of these people because these people went and murdered them. This story reminds me of the Solomon story about how God was going to give a peasant all his wealth and then he just went and killed the peasant. But in this story, these people really did lose everything because of Jesus. And also, I don't think people realize how many people have been caught up in this same sort of scam where it's ended up going wrong and someone's ended up dying or someone's ended up being beaten up or having their arms chopped off or so many other things. This stuff, it happens. Or things like this, there's so many scams out there where people are threatened with their life unless they abide to whatever the scam is. It's much better now, but in the past, there was no rules, there was no regulation, people could do whatever they want. And this to me seems like a classic case of people who are being scammed by people that are going to murder them. Miriam's story is another story of complete injustice of a woman. Miriam and Aaron were apparently just having a discussion and talking about Moses' wife, and they were saying negative things about Moses' wife. But anyway, at the end of the day, it's their opinion. People have free will, they're allowed to think what they want and have their own opinion, providing it doesn't hurt others. But according to the story, God then punished Miriam with leprosy. And Christians would read this story and be like, oh yeah, she deserved to be punished with leprosy because she was saying bad things about Moses' wife. Moses is amazing. You can't say anything about anything that he does. And if he chooses a wife, then yeah, you can't possibly say anything bad about Moses' wife, that's the Christian's version of the story. Whereas my version of the story was like, what? That's crazy. You can't punish someone for having an opinion by giving them leprosy. That would mean that God is an evil, vile, cruel bastard. Leprosy is a serious, serious disease where your hands start falling off and your life starts falling apart, literally because your body is falling apart. And God feels that this is a fair punishment to do to someone only because they had some negative opinions about someone. That's crazy. There's another detail in the story which Christians completely leave out, which is that Aaron was also saying negative things about Moses' wife, and nothing bad happened to him. So why is it that God chose to punish the female and not the male? Don't you think that's unfair? If you're a sexist person that don't care about females and think that all females deserve to be punished for their crimes, and yet males, they're males, so they can get away with it, you can't punish a male because he's a male, he's got a dick, that means you can't punish him. If that's the sort of mindset that you have, which is clearly the mindset that a lot of people do have, because they could read this story and not feel that any kind of injustice was done on the woman, and yet at the same time feel that, yes, Aaron didn't deserve to get the same sort of punishment. When you read this story, there's just so many questions that you can ask. Why did God do it? Why is this fair? Why did he only punish the woman? Why weren't they allowed to have their own opinion? It's not like they were doing anything wrong. It's not like they were hurting Moses' wife. But yeah, people like to pick and choose what they want to believe, and if they don't like something, they just ignore it. But they'll fuss about all the other things that they do like and all the things that they do agree with. I think this story is a very obvious story of how the world blanks out what it doesn't want to know and focuses in on things that it does want to know and uses the things that they do want to know for their own benefit. How anyone can read this story and be like, I want to be a preacher, I'm going to preach this message. This is ridiculous. I don't think there's any prophecy in it, but again, it is about a female who suffers, so I think it is pointing at a female sacrifice, just like Miriam was a sacrifice here. But I don't think the whole story is meant to be about a prophecy. I think it's more just meant to be an example of how terrible people were in the past and how terrible people are now, because they still don't recognize things like this. There's still so many Christians that would read this and not think anything of it. And I think when the female Christ comes, she's going to have to preach this message and preach this side of the story and tell people, why are you not thinking that this is unfair? Because it is unfair. God will come with a new gospel, and I believe that this is it. The true telling of what the Bible should mean. Not a Bible of true stories, although people did get leprosy, but, they didn't get leprosy because God has punished them. Although I do believe in reincarnation, so I do believe that some people have been born in the next life with leprosy as a form of punishment for something they did in their previous life. But it's not because they've said some negative things about a person. It's because they were probably murderers or people that were terrible people in their past life, and this is partly why they've got the body that they've got now. But at the same time, diseases like leprosy, they're going to exist for a long time until humans know how to fix them, until humans have worked out a cure and how to get rid of it. And you can't just say that because they've got leprosy, it means that they were a terrible person in their past life, because at the end of the day, you do not know what kind of life that they had in their past life. So you shouldn't judge. That's for the spirit and the matrix only. The next story I'm going to talk about is Saul's witch. She hasn't got a name, so I'm going to call her Sabrina, because Sabrina the Teenage Witch is the most famous witch in my mind. So the story about this is that Samuel was at war. Saul was one of his high generals, the person that would give a lot of the commands. Saul made a decree that all witches and mediums and anyone that practices in divination, they must be killed or cut off. The war would have killed many people, a lot of people got involved in it, but eventually Samuel died. And Saul, the general, was left wanting to know if the war can be won now that the king is dead. And so he's kind of forced to turn to a witch to try and find the answers, to see the future and to know what's going to happen. And well, he manages to find this witch that hasn't been killed, one that had survived. And he went to her to try and get the answers about what's going to happen. And this woman raised up the spirit of Samuel. And Samuel told Saul that he'll lose the war. What's strange to me, though, is that when Christ raised the dead, everyone loves him. But when this witch raises the spirit of a dead person, no one really cares. My telling of the story is that she raised this spirit to say to Saul that he'll lose. But in my mind, the battle that she was referring to, the battle that this spirit that she created was referring to, was actually the battle against witches and divination. Yes, okay, he might have lost the real war too, but then he's lost his king, so the chance of him losing the war is quite high since the king is gone, because as soon as the king goes, suddenly the men become disheartened because they feel like there's no one really worth fighting for, because usually in these wars the men would fight for the king. And if the king dies, they kind of lose their will to fight. They kind of lose their will to fight because none of them actually fight for the true reason. They're not fighting to save their people. They're fighting usually just because the king is paying them. So if the king dies, a lot of these people won't get paid, and so a lot of them will want to leave. I think that story could actually be a prophecy of what's to come. When people stop worshipping God the Father, suddenly all the people that would call themselves part of his army, they're not going to want to be part of his army any longer, because they're going to realize that that's not the way into heaven. They're not going to get paid at the end of this, and they're going to give up, and they're going to start not wanting to follow him or not wanting to fight for him. Why? Because like Samuel, he's dead. But yeah, this is just a story about how it's the female that kind of brings forth this message. It's the female that survives this war against her people. Samuel's war was against people, but Saul's war was against witches and divinations, for he was the one that made the decree about how they must all be cut off and die. But the message that this witch brought was that he would lose. The next story that I'm going to talk about is the story of Dinah. I think I'm pronouncing it right. Anyway, she was raped by Sheshem. Then after Sheshem went to his father and said, I really like this girl and I want to marry her, the father agreed, and the father went to her father and tried to convince the father of this woman to marry her off to his son. The father agreed, but said that he'll only agree if Sheshem and his whole household, so the servants, relatives, cousins, families, his whole house, they have to get circumcised. So they went off and got circumcised. They all had parts of their dick removed, but the brothers and family of Dinah didn't keep their word. They later slaughtered the whole household, Sheshem and his father included. So this is a terrible story where people break their promise, break their covenant. But at the same time, I believe that this is a story that's prophesying the future. For in the Christian's mind, people might read this and be like, oh, it's all Dinah's fault, all these people died. She was like the person that caused all these problems, caused this war between these two families. She represents the people, the bad people who have caused all this war. But it wasn't, because her being raped by the other family doesn't mean that she's done anything wrong. In my mind, this is a prophecy of what's to come, in the sense that this woman is like the Christ figure. A lot of people do wrong towards her. They sort of spiritually rape her, take her inspiration and not really care about what she wants, not ask what she wants, but rather just try and force her into this marriage. Just like Sheshem did, he just used her and then tried to force her to marry him. Just as the people believe that Jerusalem is going to be forced into a marriage with God, but they don't see Jerusalem as being a real person. They just think it's lots of people, so they don't care about this person, nor do they care about the lots of people that might not even want to be forced into marrying God. They just assume that everyone wants to marry God. Jerusalem is the new bride, so that means that everyone who's part of Jerusalem, the new bride, they're going to be forced into this marriage and they'll love it. Just like this Sheshem guy just thought that this woman would love to be with him, even though she probably doesn't want to be with him because she was just raped by him. But the people of the father, the one that's trying to force her to marry, that's the Jesus character, that's the bad relationship that she's in. In this story, all the people that are on her side, on the woman's side, they're the ones that fight the people that are on the rapist side, and they win. And I think this is a prophecy saying, which side do you want to be on? Do you want to be on the groom's side? The groom that was willing to rape this woman who I believe represents a sort of suffering Christ figure? Or do you want to be on her side and actually have sympathy for what she's gone through, what this suffering Christ has gone through? Another story that's very similar to this story is the story of Tamar. She was raped by her own brother, but the father, which is like the evil father, he took favor in the son and so didn't punish him. Tamar went to go and live with her other brother, but the other brother did take sympathy for what she went through. And later her brother goes on to kill the other brother. I don't know if he killed him because of the rape that he did on his sister, or if he killed him for another reason, but that is what happens in the story. She's raped by one brother, and the brother that's more on her side, the brother that she's living with, that brother is the one that goes and kills the other brother. In this story, I believe the woman represents Christ. The brother that raped her represents the people that are happy to sacrifice Christ. These are the people that are willing to make Christ suffer so that they can get some pleasure or something out of it. But the brother who helps her and takes her in so that she can live away from the rapist, these are the people that are actually going to help her, and they help her by killing the brother that raped her. So which brother would you rather be? The one who kills Christ, or the one that helps Christ get revenge on the people that have wronged her? There's a few more male characters that I haven't spoken about, like Moses and Noah. Moses was a guy who created a big army, and he was apparently told by God that it was fine to murder 300,000 people and then take all their virgin daughters and force them into marriage. Again, that's a terrible, terrible person. Not someone you should worship as a person of God. He hates how everyone is worshipping the golden image of a calf. That a calf is like a heifer, and well, the Bible says that the red heifer is actually the sacrifice, and so Moses here is against what the Bible says is true, which is that the Bible says that the golden calf is kind of like the sacrifice, and well, Moses is against this person and telling people not to worship the real sacrifice. But in my view, what he's worshipping is far worse. Okay, he has the 10 Commandments, but the 10 Commandments are things that all Christians break, because it says, have no other God other than me. And well, people worship Jesus and the Father, so that's 2 gods. So that rules out the first commandment. The second one is that you shouldn't have idols. Well, Jesus is an idol, and they have ignored that commandment. The third commandment is don't misuse the name of God. Well, everyone misuses the name of God because they think they have the answers, and they think they can use the name of God because they're helping God when really they're not. So many people use God's name to justify their actions when really all they're doing is using it as an excuse to cause hurt on someone or tell them that they're wrong. The fourth commandment is you only should worship on the Sabbath day, which is ridiculous. Why should that be one of the 10 top things that you should do? You know, there's millions of other things, don't rape children, don't rape anyone, don't do things like vaginal mutilation, don't be racist, don't have slaves, don't beat up people. Another commandment is love your mother and your father, have respect for them. But the Bible says that Babylon the Great is the mother of all people, all sinners. And it says that Satan is the father of lies, but he's still a father. Because Jesus said to the people, you're not of me, you're of your father, Satan. So the Bible is saying that these are the mother and father, and yet the 10 Commandments was that you should love and respect them, but people don't. There's another one about not murdering, and yet most people are willing to accept the sacrifice, accept that the murder happened for them, and they're willing to place their sins onto the sacrifice and let the sacrifice take the burden of their sins. The Lamb of God, the one that's chosen to die, that is a commandment that people are breaking. Also, most people eat meat, and a lot of religious people do actually sacrifice animals, so you are a murderer because animals are souls too. They're living souls that are going to be reincarnated and become human, but you don't actually know that bit. But yeah, you're murdering something. If you eat any kind of animal, you're murdering something. There's another one about don't give false testimony. Well, people all over the world are saying, I talked to Jesus. Jesus has come to me. He's spoken to me. And if it turns out that Jesus isn't a real person, then it will put to shame all the people that go around saying that they have a personal connection with Jesus. If Jesus was real, then it won't put any of them to shame. Because that means that all the things that Jesus has apparently said to them, it might actually be true. And all these people are just talking to the imaginary friend in their head. They're not talking to anyone, but they're going around giving false testimony about how Jesus has said this, how God has said this. And the only way these people can be punished is if the real Christ comes and it's not Jesus, and this person can prove that they're the real Christ. But magic doesn't exist here. You can only prove that you're the real Christ if you can say that all these prophecies are actually prophesying a story about me. And all these prophecies, they're all prophesying about a female Christ. They're not talking about how a male is suffering. Most of them are about how females are suffering. So the Christ figure can only be a female. Because the Christ is the one that's believed to suffer for other people's sins. And well, the Bible is all about a female suffering. Jesus did not fulfill any of those prophecies that I've mentioned in this series of videos. All the 10 Commandments are things that all Christians break. And Moses was a terrible person that didn't know what he was talking about. He spoke to trees that were burning. He's obviously got a manic schizophrenic disorder. The most famous story of Moses is how he's supposed to split the Red Sea. To me, the sea is like all the information, and well, half of it's true and half of it's false. But he's not the one that actually splits it, because he doesn't actually know the difference between what's true and what's false. He just says whatever he says, or whoever wrote the story about him, They can't guide the people because half of it's true and half of it's not true. But Moses, of course, dies in his story. Why? Because he's on the side of the water that's contained with lies. Because he is a lie. His whole character is a lie. He was never a hero of God. He's just a mythical character that probably never existed. He's like Jesus in that sense. My telling of the story is that in that part of the story, he actually represents the Christ figure and what she's going to do. She's going to separate the things that are false from the things that are true. She'll be like the little divination servant girl that's mentioned in the Bible. She'll use the stories of the prophecies in the Bible, only she'll separate the truth from the lies. Finally, there's one other story about a female, which is this medium girl who works as a servant. She's been forced to work as a fortune teller, so she does all this work, and it's most likely her masters that get all the money. But anyway, she sees these two prophets of Jesus, and she foresees that these men are true prophets of God. Only she starts to annoy them, and they insult her and call her annoying. I think she represents another type of female Christ, a female Messiah, only this one really is a servant, someone who's working for a higher power, not of her own power or will. Just like in the story, because she's working for these other people, not for her own sake. And likewise, when Christ comes, she too is going to be reading these stories and seeing how they could be prophesying a future female Messiah. And she won't be doing it really for her own sake, maybe a little bit, but she'll be doing it because she feels like she's being forced into doing it, because it will make a big change in the world if people started worshipping God the Mother rather than God the Father. I believe her role in this story is not so much what she does, because I think she's right that these men are prophesying something, but they're prophesying something that they are unaware of. They're prophesying a future Christ, someone who's not Jesus, but they are referring to this person as being Jesus, so they've got something wrong there. But I believe this woman is prophesying something about these men. But I think the main purpose of this story is to show that this woman, even though she has the same sort of powers that Jesus has, like she can predict the future, she's a servant, Christ is supposed to be a servant. Even though there's so many similarities between her and the Christ figure, people just put her down and insult her because the prophets insulted her and called her annoying. And it's just one more story of how people love the thought of a male that has powers, but they hate the thought of a woman that has powers. A servant woman, no less. Even though Jesus was supposed to be a servant, but literally he really wasn't a servant. Like, he didn't have people forcing him to do anything. Whereas this woman was really a servant, and so what the prophets were prophesying were not actually about Jesus. They were actually prophesying something that this woman is more similar to. Noah as well is one of the heroes of the Bible, when really the story just says he built an ark and then watched thousands of people drown to death because he was refusing to let them into the ark. He apparently saved 2 of every animal, but it's a completely ridiculous story because they would have just eaten each other in the ark. But say if it was true, what Noah has just done was save only him and his family, and he just said screw the rest of the world. And if you read the Bible, most of the male characters, they're terrible people that have done injustice towards others. They're not good examples, whereas all the females of the Bible, even though they do bad things by killing good people, if you actually look at the actions of these good people, you'll find that actually the good people aren't good people, they're bad people. And so this female that is responsible for killing these good people, all she's actually done is killed someone that deserves to die. A lot of these stories where the woman has betrayed a good man of God, these good men aren't good men of God. And I think these stories are just prophesying how the real Christ, the female, is going to destroy the God that everyone thinks is good, when really he's actually bad, and you should judge someone by their actions, not by what someone says about them. And particularly don't judge an old book about what it says about them. There's another character that I want to talk about, which is Asnath. This is probably my favourite character, but I've left this to last. Why? Because although the gospel of hers is very similar to all the other gospels in the Bible, this one didn't actually make it into the Bible. It's kind of like an ancient apocrypha, a story that stems from the Joseph story. That is the Joseph that had a colourful dream coat, and he was sold into slavery by his brothers because they were jealous that he was the father's favourite. But then after many years of struggle, actually ascended to be like a king's assistant. Only this is the story of his wife. The Joseph story made it into the Bible, but her story didn't. Why do I believe this happened? I believe this happened because this woman is represented as someone with quite a lot of power. She hates people, and yet she's actually seen as kind of like the good character. And while people back then didn't like powerful females that don't like people, but at the same time still are seen as godly people, because she's believed to be like supportive of the God of Israel. But in the story she does have quite a lot of power, so I reckon that's why they removed her from the Bible. Anyway, the story of Asnath is that she was a beautiful lady, very attractive. She had lots of people wanting to marry her. She was wealthy, came from a good background. She was quite promiscuous, probably flirtatious, but at the same time she hated men, and she rejected all offers that came because she only wanted the best. She wanted to marry a king, but then met Joseph, who was at the time not that powerful. Her father tried to arrange a marriage, and at the same time he made a comment that said her marriage will be like the marriage of God. But she wasn't keen on the idea because this guy, Joseph, he'd been to prison. He was kind of like a servant, and, he didn't have such a good background. And she kind of rejected him, said a few nasty things about him, but after a little while she fell in love with him and really wanted to be with him, and regretted all the nasty things that she said. She then went through 7 days of humiliation. where she turned away from the gods that she worshipped in the past, and she started to hate the world even more than before. She started to despise the idols of her ancestors, the idols that the rest of the world worshipped, and she actually removed them. We're not too sure how she removed them, but it says that she did remove all the idols, and because of this, her whole family hate her, and they've rejected her, and they've abandoned her, and she now feels like a woman in the wilderness. But before this happened, her father said that she should marry Joseph, and her father made a reference to this marriage as being like the marriage of God. I think that could be one of the triggers that stopped this book from getting into the Bible, because a lot of people want to believe that they're the bride of Christ. And because it says in this book that this woman represents the bride of God, a lot of people don't want to believe that they're like her, because this woman doesn't like the world and hates people and is very flirtatious. In the story, she's also put through a weird honeycomb ritual where someone gives her some honey and she has to attract some bees, and she does, but one of them stings her, and the person doing this ritual says to her, you know, the bees that sting you are going to die, and the bees that don't sting you are going to be on your side. And if people started preaching about this message, you know, it's obvious that this woman is actually the Christ. You know, the people that hate her are going to die, and the people that like her are going to live. That's what this message symbolizes. And I think it got removed from the Bible because people don't want to preach that kind of message. Also, she's the one that removes the idol. She's the one that goes for a sacrifice. I think her story, unlike all the other stories about a female, you know, this gives her a bit too much power, because it also says that she has 3 rooms. One of these rooms contains all the ornaments of the earth and lots of wealth of the kingdom, and, you know, there's lots of references to her as being quite powerful, and I think that's why it got removed. Anyway, she falls in love with Joseph, and she wants to serve him and just do anything just to be with him, and she regrets her past. Eventually, after the 7 days of humiliation, Joseph comes back and marries her, and he likes the fact that she doesn't like people. Why? Because Joseph was raped by some wealthy woman, and so if this woman doesn't really like men, then it means that she's not going to force anything on him. Although looking back at that story, you know, I haven't spoken about the Joseph story, but the fact that Joseph claims that he was raped by a wealthy woman kind of indicates that the story of Joseph could actually be talking about a woman, because it's very unlikely that a grown woman will rape a grown man. Why? Because they need to get hard. And if the guy isn't interested, then the guy's not going to get hard, and so the rape isn't going to happen. So this part of the story in the Joseph story seems to be pointing more at this figure who goes through lots of suffering and then ascends to rule the empire. You know, it kind of suggests that this person is actually a female. But there are occasional stories where women do seduce men and stuff, so. But she said that it was him who raped her, and so he went into prison for that. Anyway, in the story, Joseph goes off, but comes back later for this woman, and they get married. Although in my version of what's going to happen to the Christ is that this man is like the Judah character, and so he will betray her, and he will go into a sense of a prison because he won't be allowed to see her, but after this time he'll come back and they'll get married. And so that could be why there's a part in his story where some woman accuses him of being a rapist and then throws him into prison. Why? Because this woman represents God and he represents Satan, and God thinks Satan has done something wrong, and so he needs to be thrown in a prison, kept away from the person he's wronged. And so she throws him into prison, and she's like God, and that's what God does to Satan, but only for the time of the sacrifice. After the sacrifice, he comes back for her. But like the Asneth character, you know, she really regrets everything that she's done, and she really just wants to be with Joseph, and she regrets saying anything bad about him and stuff like that. Most stories, most films are based on stories about love or romance or betrayal or things like this, and I feel like every single story can be a different story that connects to the inspiration that God and her partner are going through, or are going through and have gone through in their past life as Adam and Eve. And in this video, I believe I've just explained that. I'm sure there's loads of other characters that I can talk about, and I might do that in a third video. Or I might get some backing from other film companies or anyone else that wants to help me develop these stories and give my side of how I translate the Bible. And it's not just the Bible that I can do this to. I can do this to most films and most episodes or most TV series. You know, I believe the spirit of inspiration of God lies in every single film, or not every film, but almost every film, and even the Buffy episodes. You know, I can probably do the same thing that I've done to all the Bible stories, just in the same way I can do the same thing to the Buffy stories or the Charm stories or anything like this. And I believe the power behind all this inspiration comes from the DNA that is inside of us. You know, birds, when they're flying across the earth, you know, they don't really know where they're going, but they can feel that something inside their DNA pattern, you know, is guiding them to wherever they should migrate to, and they can feel it inside of them. And likewise, humans have Eve's DNA inside them, and so they can feel her story and her inspiration, and they can feel her emotions and her life inside of them. And so this is what I mean when I say the Lord is the Lord of hosts, because it's a spirit that lies inside everyone. And so when everyone or anyone writes a story or something, part of this inspiration will come from this woman and her husband. In the Old Testament, the Bible was all about Israel. Jerusalem, Zion, daughter Zion, Mount Zion. She has many names. A woman. It was all about a woman suffering and being rejected. But after a period of time, she'll rise again. But in the New Testament, she's barely mentioned. And so it feels like Israel is the real sacrifice. She was sacrificed at the time Jesus came around, because everyone accepted Jesus, the Antichrist, and rejected the truth, rejected the mother. Most people who believe in biblical prophecies believe that there's going to be a coming 7-year tribulation period, a period of time where the Antichrist is going to rule and the bride of Christ is going to suffer during this time. Well, some people believe that there's 2 brides of Christ, one which is going to be saved and one which is going to suffer. Because the whole Bible is about the suffering bride, the suffering woman, it's clear that there isn't going to be a pre-trib rapture, and that the woman is definitely going to suffer. So that leads to the conclusion that there's either going to be a mid-trib rapture, a pre-wrath rapture, or a post-trib rapture. In the mid-trib rapture, the bride only suffers for 3.5 years. Then she's saved, and then the world suffers for 3.5 years. In the pre-wrath rapture, the woman suffers for around 6 years and is saved within the last year, the day of the Lord, which is like the terrible day as in the terrible year. Or there's the post-trib rapture, which is where the bride isn't saved at all, and she just suffers non-stop throughout the whole 7 years. And she's saved only at the end of that 7 years. I don't know how long she'll have to wait until she's saved, but I guess time will tell. And then the world is going to go through the Great Tribulation. I believe they'll go through this big tribulation because right now everyone's worshipping God the Father, and things will change dramatically when they stop worshipping that and start worshipping God the Mother, because then they'll see everything from a completely different perspective. During the time of this woman's suffering, there's supposed to be an Antichrist who's ruling. I believe that Jesus is the Antichrist. So when she discovers that she's the real Christ, it will feel like Jesus is the one that's ruling, because everyone will be worshipping him. Everyone will be looking out for him. She'll try and get help by going to preachers and churches, but everyone will be saying that, no, you're not the real Christ. This other guy is the real Christ. This other guy that doesn't exist. But because of this, Jesus is the Antichrist, not just during the last 2,000 years, but rather he'll also be the Antichrist during the suffering of this bride, because everyone will be looking up to him and no one will be looking out for her. I believe that she'll meet this father, this groom that she's going to marry. He'll know about her. He'll be rich. He'll have money. He'll have the right contacts. He'll tell lots of people about her. Hence, he'll become one of the 2 witnesses. They'll both be preaching, only he will be preaching in secret because he'll know that she's a sacrifice. He'll be like the Judah that sells her out. He'll be working with a bunch of people who are rich and have power, money, fame, wealth. But he'll make a covenant to convince them to not talk to her. This is why the Bible says that only the Father knows the date, because it's the Father that makes this arrangement. She'll be preaching the same things, only no one will listen to her. She won't have money, she won't have power, she won't have fame. She'll see celebrities making songs and films all about her. She'll know that they know what she's going through, because she'll know that she has told this person, this link between God and man. She'll tell everything that she knows to him, and she'll see the work that the celebrities are doing, and she'll know that the people know about her, only they won't come and talk to her. They'll reject her, they'll abandon her, they'll do to her exactly what the world has done to God the Mother during the last 5,000 years. She'll get a taster of how horrible it is to be rejected, and the pain that she feels will end up putting a curse on the world, so that anyone who rejects God the Mother will be rejected themselves, because this curse will be implemented from the suffering that she goes through. This curse will cause people to suffer in the same way that she did during the 7-year tribulation. But at the end, or in the middle, or somewhere in between, she will be saved. The world will find out who she is. She's the real Christ, and that Jesus is not, and things will return back to her. For even Jesus said that, you're of your father, the devil. And while that just proves that Jesus is not the father, that someone else is. And one of the 10 commandments is to have respect for your mother and father. And well, if Babylon the Great is your mother and if Satan is your father, then why would people not have respect for them? Another one of the 10 commandments is that you must have one God. And while people that worship Jesus and his father, so they're worshipping 2 gods. The Bible says that we're made in the image of God, and if Jesus is God, then that doesn't explain why there's Chinese people, or Asian people, or white people, or black people. It doesn't explain why men and women are different, because if we're all like Jesus, then why are men and women not the same? It does, however, make sense if there's both a man and a female and we're made in both of their images. Well, men are made more in his image and women are made more in her image. And this image is made through the DNA and hormones that have been formed according to these two different souls. Souls that are very different, souls that have very different lives. One will go through a life of suffering and poverty, the other one will go through a life of wealth and riches. You know, part of how a person is according to the kind of background and upbringing that they have. And so if they have very different upbringings, that could explain why males and females are very different, because we're both made in the image of two different people who have gone through two very different lives. I said earlier in this video that I believe the temple of God is a woman, and well, the Bible also says that there's 3 temples of God. Because of this, I don't think that Christ has just had one life. I believe that she was Eve, and then she died, and I believe she's had another life as a coloured person who has lived recently, and then she's died and was reborn again on the 3rd day. This is another one of the prophecies, that Christ will come, die, and rise again on the 3rd day. If this can be proven, then this would be a huge amount of evidence that would prove once and for all that she is the real Christ. But the Bible also talks about the 4 horsemen. It describes the beast as being the beast that was, that is, and it yet is to come. And so because of this, I don't think there's actually 3 temples. I believe there's 4 temples. But because people aren't waiting for the 4th one, it's an indication that we're probably at the 3rd temple right now. And the 4th temple is something that's going to come in the future. Although if she can do all her work in the 3rd temple, then this 4th temple might never actually be famous, might never actually be revealed. But there are 4 main different types of people, I would say. There's black, white, Middle Eastern, and Asian. If we're made in the image of God, then it would make sense that God has actually had 4 lives, and that we're made in these 4 images. And likewise, every time she comes, her male counterpart also needs to come down. This is my religion, the prophecies of the female Messiah.